Welcome back, everyone. Some big topics I want to go into today. Also, do some breaking news. I want to talk though about an article that, of all places, well, maybe to be expected, New York Times had talking about the possible need for involuntary, meaning you don't want to do it necessarily; it's forced upon you. Euthanasia. Typically, we would historically just call that democide or even genocide. The mass killing in this case of elderly people because they say there's overpopulation. And they cite a Japanese Yale professor talking about this, who it's a very bizarre story, and they kind of try to write it off as him not really meaning it. But then through the whole article, they suggest that he did mean it, and then they even kind of talk about why we might need something like that. I think it's absolutely ridiculous, but this is where the discussion is going, and I think it's important to address this. I also want to go into the weaponization of government hearings now taking place and some of the stuff they're revealing. But first, though, folks, some updates with the rail crash. There's different news reports claiming, and I haven't seen the actual data on this yet, but I've been seeing reports all over the place, claiming that there have been traces of the chemical from the rail crash found in the Ohio River, and there's concerns of water contamination. It's not clear how much of an issue this is or what it means, but given, 10% of the country gets its water from the Ohio River, that could be a pretty big deal. I'll keep you all updated on this. I haven't seen any major warnings on it yet, other than just some posts. It's not clear how much the contamination is, or whether it's going to last. Keep in mind, when you have water flowing very quickly, typically it's not going to be a lasting disaster. So I don't think it's going to impact things for too long. But it is of concern. At the same time as well, there have been some other rail crashes since, including in Texas, I believe Louisiana. I was looking at data on annual rail derailments, and they're actually pretty frequent, way more frequent than I actually thought. And so it might not necessarily be out of the norm, but again, given the fact that this is, of course, a big issue now, people are paying attention to it. Of course, we're going to focus more on the incidents that normally maybe we would not pay attention to. Regardless, I will keep you all updated on this as it develops. And again, keep in mind the big story here, as far as I'm concerned, is the fact that, the Biden administration overrode the rail unions on their strike for, things like paid sick leave, for the ability of rail workers to maybe get a bit of rest every now and then, because they were saying they were overworked and there were other problems. I've read different claims of what may have caused the crash, including basically forcing people to just ride through the crisis as it happened. Nothing too solid yet, but as information comes out, I will keep you updated. All right, folks, that said, let's jump into the first story. Let's talk about involuntary euthanasia. And I wouldn't even call it euthanasia at that point. I think euthanasia is a deceptive word that should just be murder. If you're killing people against their will, we don't call that euthanasia. We call that murder. And if you do it on a large scale, that would be genocide, or if it's by your own government, democide. That is what's being proposed right now in an article by the New York Times. The same publication, by the way, it's been promoting cannibalism lately. Those of you on YouTube, Rumble, Twitter, Facebook, we will jump over exclusively to Epic TV after about 25 minutes, just so you know. So be sure to join us there. I do an hour and a half show. All right, folks, let's jump into it. This is New York Times, and it says here, a Yale professor suggested mass suicide for old people in Japan. What did he mean? Well, he probably meant what he said. And it's a very bizarre story, because they claim he did not mean what he said, then say that his followers support what he said, then say he actually says what he said quite often, and it's one of his main narratives, and then they argue for the virtues, or lack thereof. They argue for what he said. This is very mental gymnastics you find very common with New York Times, where they suggest something to start a national discussion, which we're engaging in, I guess, right now, but in a way that, frankly, I view this with absolute disgust. I think this is terrible, and I think they should be called out for it. But it says here, Yusuke Narita says he is mainly addressing a growing effort to revamp Japan's age-based hierarchies. It's a hierarchy, folks. It's the privileged and the underprivileged, but there it's about age. It says still he has pushed the country's hottest button. Further, it states in interviews and public appearances, Yusuke Narita, an assistant professor of economics at Yale, this was a conservative, they'd be fired for this, I'll tell you right now, has taken on the question of how to deal with the burdens of Japan's rapidly aging society. And he said, quote, "I feel like the only solution is pretty clear," he said during one online program in late 2021. Quote, "In the end, isn't it mass suicide and mass seppuku of the elderly?" He says it's the one solution that's pretty clear. Maybe we can call it the final solution, in fact, for the elderly, as he's putting it, right? And it says here, seppuku is an act of ritual disembowelment, which was a code among the dishonored samurai in the 19th century. Last year, when asked by a school-age boy to elaborate on his mass seppuku theories, where he's promoting mass suicide for the elderly, he was asked to elaborate. It says Dr. Narita graphically described to a group of assembled students a scene from Midsummer, a 2019 horror film in which a Swedish cult sends one of its oldest members to commit suicide by jumping off a cliff. That movie is very disturbing, by the way, but I'm aware of that scene. It's basically this creepy pagan cult in Sweden. And when a person reaches a certain age, they force that person to kill themselves. And if they do not successfully kill themselves, they're then killed by the community. The professor cited that when he was asked to elaborate on what he was proposing. The idea that, for the good of society, maybe after a certain age, you should just die or be killed. It says further in, at other times, he has broached the topic of euthanasia. And he stated the possibility of making it mandatory in the future, right? He said in one interview, will come up in discussions. You hear that, folks? What do you call mandatory euthanasia? What do you call mandatory suicide? Is it suicide if it's mandatory? If someone kills themselves and they were forced to do it, do you call that suicide? If it's mass suicide and the government, for example, forces you to do it, do you still call that euthanasia?